In this video, we're going to learn about debugging Node.js. Because, let's face it, there will always be some bugs in our code, no matter how careful we are. And so it's good to have a tool to help us with debugging our code. Now, this is not really about error handling with Express, but I thought this was a good point in the course to introduce you to a debugging tool, which we might then use throughout the rest of the course. And there are different ways of debugging Node.js code. For example, we could use VS Code for that, but actually Google very recently released an amazing tool which we can use to debug, which is called NDB. Alright, so let's move over to our other terminal here and then install NDB. And NDB, which stands for Node Debugger, is actually just an npm package. So npm install NDB. Alright, and you should then install it as a global package. Alright, and if you're on a Mac, you might need global permissions. So just write sudo here in front. Or if you're not at all able to install it globally, you can always just install it locally as a dev dependency. So just like this. Alright. Anyway, please go ahead and install this tool now. I'm not going to do it because it can be quite a heavy download and that takes a bit too long now. Anyway, as soon as you have the tool installed, then let's head over to package.json and add a new script here. Alright, and I'm going to call that one debug. Okay, and so the command that we want to run here is simply ndb, so the node debugger, and then again our entry point, so server.js. Okay, and now this is going to work no matter if you installed ndb locally or globally. Alright, so let's now run the script. And in order for this to work, we actually need to finish this process, because it's basically going to start the server as well, and so it will then try to do it on the same port, and that's of course not going to work. So we need to finish the one that's currently running, and then from here we can run npm run debug. Alright, and so now a new Chrome window should open, so what's called a headless Chrome, but it's not a real Chrome. So you will see the Chrome icon down here and also here in the menu bar, but really this is just the Node debugger. So what do we have here? Well, on the left side we have our complete file system. We also have access to our npm scripts here, which we can actually run from here. We also have a console, and so here we have our usual outputs with the app running and the database connection. And we also have the performance and memory tabs, which we're not going to use. Alright, now if you're familiar with the general debugging process, then all of this is going to be kind of familiar to you. Alright, but if not, then don't worry, I will show you a couple of techniques throughout this video. Alright, anyway, let's now open up our server.js. And one thing that's really amazing is that we can actually edit our files in here, so right in this debugger. So for example, let's say that we find a bug and we then want to fix it right away. And we can do that right here in the debugger, and it will then update the original code. So just to test it, let's just add a comment down here. So test, then hit Command or Control S to save. And then when we go back to our code and open up server.js, then you will see that the comment is actually here. Okay? And if we now delete it from here, give it a save, and back to the debugger, then it is going to be gone from here as well. Okay, but now about the debugging itself, I would say that the fundamental aspect of debugging is to set breakpoints. So breakpoints are basically points in our code that we can define here in the debugger where our code will then stop running. It will basically freeze in time, and we can then take a look at all our variables. Okay, and so that will then be extremely useful to find some bugs. Now right now there's not any bug in here, but let's still add a breakpoint. And I'm going to add that breakpoint here in this line 21. So I click here on this line, and then you see this green marker. Okay, and so that means that the code will stop at this point when we execute it. Okay, and you actually can see it here on the right side on the breakpoints tab here as well. Now our application is actually already running at this point and basically waiting for requests to come in. And so what we need to do here is to right click and then click on Run the Script. Okay, and so that will then basically run the script here again. All right, and so here we go. So you see here on the right side that it says paused on breakpoint. And so all the code that is above this breakpoint here has already executed at this point. And so we can now take a look at the variables. For example, we can hover this port variable and we see that it's set to 3000. And also actually it displays here in this code here, all right? And then the third way of seeing it is here on the right side. So we have a couple of basically tabs here. So node processes, the watch, the call stack, which is not really important for now, the scope, and so in the scope is where all our variables are. Okay, and so here again, you have the port set to 3000. Okay, and here you can also see the 5 variables that we have access to in all modules. Remember that from the modules lecture? So we have the directory name, we have the file name, we have the require function, we have module, and we have exports. So remember, these are the 5 variables that are available in each and every module. And actually, when we execute the code like this in the debugger, we can see that our entire code is in fact wrapped into this function, right? So this wrapper function that gives us access to these 5 variables. All right. Next, I also want to take a look at our app variable. So basically the Express application that we export from app.js, remember that. And here is really a ton of stuff, but what I find interesting is to take a look at this router here. Okay, and so in router we then have stack. Okay, and so let's open this up a little bit. And so this stack here is basically the middleware stack that we have in our application. Okay, for example, we have our JSON parser here. We have the code that serves the static files. So take a look at that here in app.js. So this express.static. We also have the logger here, which comes here from using Morgan. Then you have these next 2 middleware functions. So these 2 here, which are anonymous. So this one and this one. And maybe we can take a look at them, but not really. Okay, it doesn't matter. So this is really just for curiosity and showing you that we actually can take a look at our middleware stack. Okay, then finally we have our 2 routers. Okay, so we have the router, and you see here actually the route for which it applies. So API/v1/tours, right? And so I find this really interesting. Of course, we still have the users here as well. And so with this, we really can take a look at how the Express application works behind the scenes. Okay, so let's close up all of this. And the other thing that I wanted to show you is here in the global variables, because here we have the process variable, or at least we should have it somewhere here. Yeah, so indeed, here it is. So here we have the process variable that is, remember, available everywhere. And so that's why it's called here a global variable. Then in there we have process.env. And remember that this is where all our environment variables are stored. And so indeed, here we have our database string, we have the local database, the password, and really all the other environment variables that we defined in our config.env file. All right, so really interesting stuff that we can take a look at here. But now let's continue with our debugging. Okay, so we stopped the code, we froze it in time here at this point, so at line 21. Okay, and so now we can click here on this button in order to actually continue running the code. And since we have no more breakpoints, the code will then break no more and basically finish running. So let's do that. And so now our application is really running. Let's take a look at that in the console. Okay, so app running on port 3000 and DB connection successful, of course. What happened here? Now, all right. So let's now quickly do a request here. So simply one for /tours. And now we have all this junk here, and I'm going to take care of that in a second. All right, and if we now come back to our console here, then of course we have all the code that we had before. Like his hello from the middleware and then how long the query actually took. All right, and now before we do anything else, let's actually get rid of these junk tours. So I'm going to reload it here. And I guess they will be somewhere here at the end. So test whatever here. So let's get rid of it. This is the secret tour, and I actually want to keep it here. But everything from here on, we no longer want. And so yeah, so now we're back to having just 10 tours, just as before. Anyway, let's now actually set a breakpoint in a function that handles this route. Okay, and so we come to our controllers folder, and there we have the tour controller. Okay, and then the handler function is this get all tours. So for now, all I want to do is to just set a breakpoint here so that we can take a look at what these variables look like after the query is already done. So this code here will get our tours, and we will then stop the code basically before actually sending it as a response. Okay, and so all we need to do is to actually do the request, because that will then trigger that function, right? And so since we have a breakpoint, we automatically move back to this window here and to the point where the code has stopped. So what kind of variables do we have here? So you see that we have the request and the response, and we also have the features variable and the tours, of course. So let's first take a look at the request. And here again, you see that we have all kinds of stuff really. So we have the base URL, we have the method, we have, for example, request.query, which right now is empty because we didn't pass any query string, but you see that it's really already here. Okay, and so you start seeing now how handy this can be in order to debug our code. So basically to freeze our code in time, instead of having to do all these console.logs that we used to do up until this point. So usually when we wanted to take a look at like the query, for example, we would do a bunch of console.logs and use that to figure out a bug in case that something was not working, right? But now we have this amazing tool which can help us avoid all of these console.logs, for example. Then we also have the response, of course. And again, you see all of these properties and methods that are on there, and they are not really interesting for us now. What I wanted to show you is, of course, that at this point we already have the tours, okay? So we have 9 tours. So let's take a look at them. And it looks kind of weird here. So in order to get access to the actual values, we need to click here. Okay, so that's a bit weird, but it works, of course. And so you see that in fact our tours are already here, and of course the features as well. So you see here that the features are an instance of the API features class, just as we defined it, and in there we have the query and the query string. Great, so this is how we take a look at all the variables, and this is how the most important parts of the debugger work. Now in order to now learn a bit about the debugging process itself, let's introduce a very small bug into our code and then take a look at how we can use these tools that we have here to basically take a deeper look at our code. So I'm now going to resume the script execution in order to basically run the rest of the code. Okay, and so that should be done now. And so now here we have our response. So you see that it took all this time here, so 3 minutes and 29 seconds, but that's just because we paused the execution for so long. Okay, now let's come to our code here. Let's close what we no longer need. So in the tour controller, or actually in our API features file, I want to introduce a small bug here in the limit fields. So let's say that we were trying to implement this method here, but instead of joining with a space here, we forgot to put it here. And so let's just say that we joined without any space. And so this would then give us a weird result, right? So let's actually test that out. So let's say fields, and that we wanted only the name and the duration, right? Now before I can actually send that request, let's remove the breakpoint here. Okay, send the request, and now we actually do not get the name and the duration. All right, so let's pretend that is our bug now, and that we're now trying to figure out why this is not working. Okay, so let's go to our debugger, and we know that the error must probably be somewhere in our limit fields method, right? And so let's basically stop the code from executing at this point. Okay, because this is where this method will actually be called, and so from here we can then enter that function, so that method. Okay, so let's then fire off that request now, and so now indeed we're back to our debugger automatically. So at this point, this line and this line and this line of code have already executed, and so let's now use the step tool. Okay. And what step will do is that it will basically execute the next line of code. And in this case, that will be inside of the limit fields method. So step, and it will then move right into that function. Okay, so let's take a look at what we have here. For example, this .query string is name, duration. So that is correct, right? Okay, so let's step to the next line. All right. And so this is where this operation is actually happening. Then, next up, let's take a look at our variables here. And so here we now see field, and so here we have our bug, okay? So the problem is, of course, that we have no space between name and duration. And so that's why it's not working. So fields is, of course, defined here. And so like this, we can find our bug and correct it right away. So remember that the edits that we do here are reflected immediately in the code. So give it a save, and then it will do it again. So I can keep stepping, and so now fields is correct. So name space duration. Then the next line of code, and now we entered into the select method on the query. But we're not interested in that at all, and so we can say step out of current function. Okay, so that select that we just saw was running this function here. Okay, but of course we were not interested in that, and so we just quit it and moved on to the next line. So now we have returned this, next line, and again, and so now we're back to where we were, but in the next line. So let's keep doing that. And so now we're into paginate, but we're not really interested in this one. And so let's again step out of the current function. And now we're here at the tours definition, which at this point is not yet done. And so let's again say step. And so now at this point, our tours should be defined. All right. So we have our 9 tours over here. Let's take a look at them. And here they are. And actually they have all the data. So not just the one that we defined, or in fact, actually it doesn't. So we really only have the name and the duration. So duration, name, and all the other ones are undefined. And so that's just because we limited our query to only these 2 fields, remember? Now what I also wanted to show you is here in the features, we can take a look at our query. And here we have the fields property, for example, where we see duration set to 1 and name set to 1. And so that's exactly the 2 names that we selected. We also have these options here, which is sort, which is at this point set to created -1. And so that's coming from here. So this here. So basically what this method here, this sort method is going to do is that it will add this sort property here to these options. All right. And then we also have limit and skip, which of course come here from paginate. Okay, so I thought that is also kind of interesting. And yeah, so our code is now actually fixed. Let's keep running this. And so we now should have our correct result. Now, here it says we could not get any response, and that's because we took too long fixing our code. So we got an error connecting, but if we now send it again, and now we do it quicker, or actually we could remove our breakpoint entirely. So let's keep it running. Let's go back, and now indeed we get the duration and the name as well. So that's because we just fixed our code using the NDB debugger. So great. That's really an amazing and helpful tool that we're gonna keep using throughout the rest of the course. Maybe not always. Sometimes it's quicker to just throw in a console.log, but really in some more complicated cases, I like to use this kind of tool.